The sound came without warning, not loud at first, just a sharp crack, the kind that splits through background noise and stops every conversation dead, and then the clatter of a coffee mug tumbling across a linoleum counter, and then silence so complete that even the rattling heater in the corner of Mercy Café seemed to hold its breath. Martha Bennett stood with one hand pressed against her cheek. Her eyes were down. Her shoulders were shaking, and Sheriff Wade Coulter was already turning back toward his booth like nothing had happened, straightening his jacket sleeve with the casual ease of a man who had never once been told no. In the corner, a man no one had paid much attention to slowly set down his coffee cup. Welcome back to Jack and Rex Tales, where the quietest people sometimes carry the heaviest hearts, and where loyalty, courage, and kindness still matter more than anything else in this world. Jack Thompson had not planned to stop in Blackwater Ridge. He had been driving for 3 days through West Virginia's mountain roads, the kind that wind through exhausted hollows where the trees grow too close and the sky feels far away, with no destination in mind and no particular reason to stop anywhere. Just moving, the way he had learned to do when the silence inside the truck cab became louder than the engine. Rex sat in the passenger seat the way he always did, upright, steady, amber eyes tracking the road ahead with the same quiet discipline he had carried since his military working days. 8 years old now, his muzzle touched with gray, but his posture never slouted, never restless, just present, the way only dogs who have survived hard things learn to be present, completely, without reservation, without asking for anything in return. It had been somewhere outside of Elkins that Jack pulled off onto a gravel shoulder in the dark, engine still running, hands resting on the wheel without gripping it. The nightmare had followed him out of sleep again, the same one. Sand and smoke, and the sound of a name he could no longer say out loud without his chest closing around it. He sat there for a long time. Rex did not whine, did not paw at him. He simply shifted across the seat until his large, warm body was pressed firmly against Jack's arm and stayed there, breathing slowly. An anchor made of fur and loyalty, and something Jack had never found a word for, though he had tried many times in the dark hours of many long nights. "All right," Jack finally said quietly, to no one in particular. Rex's tail moved once. They drove on. Mercy Café appeared through the pre-dawn fog like something a person might dream. Yellow light bleeding through cracked windows, a hand-painted sign, 2 pickup trucks in the gravel lot with frost still on their hoods. Jack pulled in because Rex needed water, and because the cold had worked into his bad knee again, and because sometimes a man simply needs to sit somewhere warm among other human beings, even if he has nothing to say to any of them. He chose the corner booth without thinking about it. Old habit. Back to the wall, full view of the room, every exit accounted for. Rex settled beneath the table and rested his chin on Jack's boot. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, and something underneath both of those things. Something older, like wood that had absorbed decades of hard mornings and quiet prayers. Photographs of young soldiers covered one wall. Some of them were smiling, some were not. Jack did not look at them for long. Martha came to take his order with the kind of tired warmth that belongs to women who have been carrying other people's weight for so long they no longer notice it anymore.
She had kind eyes and arthritic hands, and she called him honey the same way she called everyone honey, not as a pleasantry, but as something she actually meant. "Coffee," Jack said, "and whatever's hot." "That'd be the biscuits. The gravy's not bad either if your stomach's up for it this early." "Gravy's fine." She smiled at him just briefly and glanced down at Rex beneath the table without saying anything about him being there. Then she went back behind the counter.
Jack watched the room the way he always watched rooms. Not suspiciously, just carefully. The elderly man behind the counter, Walter, according to the embroidery on his shirt, moved slowly and breathed with the labored effort of someone whose lungs had been damaged over a long lifetime of hard work. A young deputy sat at the counter, nursing coffee, still green enough that his uniform looked slightly too large for his sense of authority. An older woman near the window was reading quietly, turning pages with the patience of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. Ordinary people, tired people, the kind Jack recognized because he had grown up among them, before the Navy, before the wars, before everything else that had changed the shape of his life. He thought briefly of Margaret the way he always eventually did in quiet moments. How she used to love small diners exactly like this one. How she would have already been talking to Martha, asking about her grandson, finding the thread of connection she found everywhere with everyone. That was her gift. She could walk into a room full of strangers and within 20 minutes make them feel like family. Jack had never been able to do that. He just sat in corner booths and drank coffee and tried to stay steady. Rex pressed closer against his boot. Then the door opened and the temperature in the room dropped before the cold air even reached anyone. Dropped the way it does when a particular kind of person enters a space. And Sheriff Wade Coulter walked in. He was a large man, not from physical fitness, but from the particular kind of inflation that comes with unchallenged authority over a long period of time. He moved through the diner like he owned the floor beneath it. The young deputy straightened immediately. Walter's movements behind the counter became smaller, more careful. Even the woman by the window seemed to shrink slightly into her chair without appearing to move at all. Jack watched this and understood it immediately. He had seen that specific fear before, not in war zones, but in places where one person had spent years making sure everyone around them remembered who held the power. Coulter dropped into a booth, ordered without looking at Martha, and pulled out his phone. Martha refilled his coffee with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in her own workplace. And then her arthritic hand caught the edge of the cup.
Coffee spread across the table in one fast, dark wave and splashed across the front of Coulter's jacket, and the sound he made was not words, it was something beneath words. And then his hand moved, and the crack of it landing against Martha's cheek was so sharp and sudden that for a full second no one in the diner processed what had happened. Below the table, Rex was on his feet before the sound finished echoing. Jack felt the dog's entire body transform beneath his hand, every muscle going rigid with trained instinct, a low vibration moving through the German shepherd's chest that was not quite a growl, but was something older and more serious than a growl. And Rex's amber eyes were locked on Coulter with an intensity that left no ambiguity about what he was prepared to do. Jack pressed his hand firmly against Rex's shoulder. The dog stopped, stood trembling with restraint, muscles coiled, eyes never leaving the sheriff, but he stopped because Jack's hand was there, and that hand was the only authority Rex had ever fully surrendered to.
Martha had not moved. Her hand was still pressed against her cheek. Her eyes were on the floor. Nobody in the diner spoke. Jack sat for a moment in that silence and felt something move through him that was not anger exactly. It was older than anger, quieter than anger, the specific cold clarity that had carried him through the worst moments of his life overseas. He breathed through it once, then he stood up slowly, the way a man stands when he has already decided something and no longer needs to think about it. He walked to the counter. He picked up the broken pieces of the mug Martha had dropped without being asked, carrying them behind the counter and depositing them carefully in the trash. He found a rag beneath the counter and wiped the coffee from the floor. The sugar dispenser near the register had been jammed for what looked like weeks. He worked it loose with 2 careful adjustments and set it back in place. Then he returned to his booth, laid enough money on the table to cover his meal 3 times over, and tucked an additional folded bill beneath the edge of his plate where only Martha would find it. He did all of this without once looking at Sheriff Coulter.
That was what broke something open in the room. Not confrontation, not raised voices, just a man quietly and completely refusing to behave as though what had happened was acceptable, while also refusing to become ugly about it, treating Martha's dignity as something worth protecting through action rather than performance. Walter stood behind the counter watching this with eyes that had gone very still. Coulter could not tolerate being made invisible. He followed Jack to the door with the lazy confidence of a man who had never genuinely been challenged, and when Jack turned to leave, Coulter put one hand against Jack's chest, said something low and intended to humiliate. Jack looked at the hand on his chest, then looked up at Coulter and said nothing at all. That silence, apparently, was worse than anything Jack could have said. Coulter hit him across the face. Rex came out from underneath the table in one movement, crossing the diner floor before anyone else had reacted, placing himself directly between Jack and the sheriff, with every line of his body communicating something absolute and final. Jack crouched down, took the dog's face gently in both hands. "Easy, buddy," he said quietly. "I'm all right." Rex looked at him, into him, the way this dog always had, the way he had on that terrible winter night years ago when Jack had sat alone in the dark and Rex had pressed against him and stayed and stayed and stayed until morning came and something shifted and Jack chose to still be here. The German shepherd's body slowly released its coil. He pressed his forehead against Jack's hands and held there. There was not a person in Mercy Café who was not undone by that moment, not one. Coulter arrested Jack on charges that fooled no one, and everybody pretended to believe. Rex was chained to a post outside the station as an afterthought, the sheriff's way of removing the part of the situation that made him most uncomfortable, without having to acknowledge why. The snow began that evening and did not stop. Rex did not lie down. He stood at the station door through the first hour and the second hour, and through the long, dark middle of the night when the street was empty and the cold settled into everything, and his breath came in small, steady clouds that disappeared into the dark above him. He did not bark. He did not pull at the chain. He stood with the patience of a creature who understood, on some level deeper than training, that the person on the other side of that door needed him to still be there when it opened. An elderly woman on her way home from her sister's house stopped and looked at him for a long moment, then went home and came back with a bowl of water that froze slightly at the edges before Rex finished drinking it. A truck driver cut his engine across the street and sat watching the dog for 20 minutes before leaving without explanation.
A small girl pressed her face against a car window as her father drove slowly past and whispered something to him that made the man pull over and sit with his hands on the wheel for a long time. Deputy Caleb Hayes came outside near midnight and sat on the cold steps beside Rex and said nothing. He was a young man, still assembling himself, still deciding what kind of person he was going to be, and he sat there in the dark, wrestling with the specific weight of knowing something is wrong and being afraid of what it costs to say so. Rex turned and placed one paw very gently on Caleb's knee. Just that. Left it there. Caleb looked down at the paw and then looked away and pressed his mouth together hard against something that was climbing up his throat. He sat there for a very long time. Then he went back inside. The next morning, he began quietly copying security footage. The truth moved through Blackwater Ridge the way truth moves through small towns when it finally decides to move. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, person to person, through church pews and diner booths, and phone calls made in low voices after the children were asleep. Walter brought forward evidence he had kept hidden for years beneath the weight of his own shame. Eleanor Price, who knew every family's grief in the county, carried truth with the same quiet persistence she carried everything. Martha decided one morning, in a way she could not entirely explain, that she was finished being small.
Federal investigators arrived on a gray Tuesday morning 3 weeks later when the snow had hardened to ice on the roads and the mountains sat white and impassive above the town. There were no speeches, no dramatic confrontations. Sheriff Wade Coulter was escorted from his own station in handcuffs with the calm procedural efficiency of people who had done this before and would do it again, and the town watched from windows and doorways with the particular stunned quiet of people who had waited a very long time to see something and were not entirely sure yet what to do with the feeling of finally seeing it. Jack had already been released days before. He did not stay to watch. He was sitting in his truck at the edge of the Mercy Café parking lot with Rex beside him and the engine running when Martha came out through the diner's side door carrying a dish towel in one hand and something else in the other. She walked to his window without hurrying, and he rolled it down. She handed him a piece of apple pie wrapped in foil, and then, after a small hesitation, an old photograph. A man in desert camouflage, standing squinting into hard sunlight somewhere that was not West Virginia. Young, proud, already carrying something in his eyes that the camera had caught without meaning to. "My husband," Martha said. "Desert Storm. He passed 11 years ago." Jack looked at the photograph for a long moment. "He would have liked you," Martha said quietly. "That's all I wanted to say." Jack could not answer immediately. His jaw worked once. He looked down at the photograph, and something moved across his face that he could not control and did not try to. Grief and recognition, and the specific loneliness of a man who had spent years believing no one could see him anymore. Rex leaned slowly across the seat and rested his chin on Jack's leg. Jack finally looked up. He smiled, just barely, just the edges of it, the kind of smile that cost something, and nodded once. Then he rolled the window up gently and pulled out of the lot and drove away down the mountain road while the snow began again, soft and indifferent and beautiful, covering everything equally the way it always does. Not a hero leaving town, just a man and his dog moving through the world as carefully as they knew how, leaving something behind them that had not been there before. A town that remembered finally what decency felt like,
and how little it had actually required. Just one person refusing to look away. This story carries significant educational and human value that extends well beyond its emotional surface. It illustrates that moral courage does not require physical dominance or loud confrontation, that the most powerful form of resistance available to ordinary people is the deliberate, consistent choice to remain decent when everything around them has normalized cruelty. For older viewers who have lived through their own seasons of silence and regret, Jack's quiet intervention reflects something true about how change actually moves through communities, not through a single heroic act, but through small, dignified choices that give other people permission to make their own. This story also speaks honestly to the invisible wounds carried by veterans and to the profound, often unspoken bond between a man and his dog that goes far beyond companionship. A bond that in the darkest moments can be the only thing standing between a person and despair. Rex, waiting in the snow through the night, is not merely a moving image. It is a portrait of loyalty in its purest form, the kind that asks for nothing and remains anyway. For a generation that values duty, sacrifice, and quiet faithfulness above almost anything else, that image speaks a language they recognize in their bones. The story also gently confronts the danger of collective silence in the face of abuse, how fear becomes a community's habit, and how one person's courage can interrupt that habit and remind people who they actually want to be. These are not abstract lessons. They are the kinds of truths that older Americans have watched play out across lifetimes, in families, in towns, in the long American story of ordinary people trying to hold on to their dignity against forces that profit from them letting it go.